The doors of the Silver Birch restaurant had barely stopped swinging when the first fist landed on the Alpha King's table, hard enough to rattle every plate in the room. Cale Ashford did not flinch. He set down his fork slowly, the way a man does when he wants the person across from him to understand that they have already made a very serious mistake. His eyes moved up from his plate, calm and dark, and he looked at the 5 men who had arranged themselves around his corner table like they had rehearsed it. He had not told anyone where he was going that evening. Not his guards, not his counsel, not even his personal aide, who had worked beside him for 6 years and knew his habits better than most. This evening was supposed to be his alone, a private hour he had carved out for reasons he had not shared with a single person in his palace. And yet 5 men were standing around his table with the practiced stillness of soldiers who had been waiting. The man who had hit the table was named Garrett Cole. Cale recognized him from the border dispute reports his intelligence officers had filed 3 months ago. Garrett led what remained of the Ironshaw Pack, one of 5 border packs that Cale's father had broken in the war 20 years prior. Beside Garrett stood Owen Drake, the eldest surviving son of the Drake bloodline, and next to him were 3 others whose faces Cale had studied in briefing documents but had never expected to encounter in a restaurant 60 miles from the capital. The Silver Birch was a small place. 10 tables, wooden floors that had been polished so many times they had developed a warm amber shine. There were pressed flowers framed on the walls and a small chalkboard near the entrance, where the day's specials were written in careful, looping handwriting. It smelled of bread and herbs and something faintly sweet that Cale had recognized the moment he walked in, something that had pulled at a memory he could not quite reach. The other diners had gone very still. A couple near the window sat frozen with their wine glasses halfway to their mouths. An older man in a green coat had pushed his chair back slightly, the way people do when they are trying to decide between staying seated and running. Cale did not look at any of them. He looked at Garrett. "You picked an interesting location," Cale said. "We picked the right location," Garrett replied. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "Somewhere, you came alone. Somewhere, nobody would think to look for you." Cale reached for his glass of water and took a slow sip. "You've been following me." "We've been watching the people who watch you," Owen said from the left. "Every pattern has a crack in it. Yours is smaller than most, but it's there." Cale set the glass down. He said nothing. One of the men he did not recognize moved quietly toward the restaurant's front door. Cale heard the lock click, then a second man drifted toward the back, where the kitchen entrance was, and that door locked too. The older man in the green coat made a short, sharp sound of alarm. "Everyone else stays calm," Garrett said to the room, not raising his voice. "This does not involve you. Stay seated, and nothing happens to you." The couple near the window did not move. The older man pulled his coat tighter around himself, as though it could protect him from whatever was about to happen. Cale shifted slightly in his chair. Something was wrong, and it was not the 5 men surrounding him. He had faced worse odds. He had fought in border wars before he was crowned, had trained since the age of 9 with the best combat instructors his father's court could supply. 5 opponents in a restaurant was a problem he could work through. But something was wrong with him. He noticed it when he tried to call on the deeper strength that all wolves of his rank could reach. The surge of awareness and power that had never once failed him in 31 years. It was not there. It was like reaching for a door handle in the dark and finding only wall. He breathed slowly and tried again. Nothing. His food. He looked down at the half-eaten plate in front of him. The bread, the broth, the careful arrangement that had seemed so ordinary 20 minutes ago. Someone had put something in it. Cale did not let the realization show on his face. His expression remained exactly as it had been, quiet, unhurried, the expression of a man who was still deciding how seriously to take the situation. Internally, he was recalculating everything. "You went to a great deal of trouble," he said. "Your father took everything from our families," Garrett said. 20 years of watching our packs scrape by on borderland that nobody wanted, while the capital built new towers and held festivals. 20 years. His voice did not waver, but something behind his eyes did. "We are not here because we want to be. We are here because every other option was taken from us before we were old enough to choose." Cale heard the honesty in that. He did not dismiss it. "What happened to your families was not nothing," Cale said. "I've read the records. I know what the war cost." "Then you know why we're standing here," I know why you believe you're standing here, Kale said, but I also know that whoever helped you get here, whoever tracked my movements and prepared whatever is in that food, they did not do it out of sympathy for your families. Something flickered in Garrett's expression, just for a moment. Then it closed again. That flicker told Kale everything he needed to know. These 5 men were not the architects of this plan. They were the instruments of it. Someone else had set this in motion, someone who had access to his schedule, his route, the name of this specific restaurant, and the knowledge of what would suppress his abilities entirely, someone who knew him well enough to lace his meal with something his own healers had not warned him about. The locked doors, the prepared positions, the precise timing. Kale looked down at his plate once more. Then he looked up, past Garrett, past Owen, past the other 3, and his eyes landed on the young woman who had been moving very quietly near the far side of the room since the doors had locked. She was carrying an empty tray. She had stopped walking entirely. She was standing between 2 tables with the tray held flat at her side, and she was watching him, not the 5 men, him, with an expression that was impossible to read from across the room. She was the waitress who had brought him his meal, and she was the only person in this room who did not look afraid. Kale held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before Garrett moved, and the room stopped being quiet. The first thing Kale did when Garrett's hand came toward him was step aside. He was not moving at full strength, but years of training do not vanish because a suppressant is clouding the deeper part of what he was. He moved on instinct and muscle memory, and Garrett's grip caught his sleeve instead of his arm. He caught Garrett's wrist on the return, applied pressure to exactly the right point, and Garrett dropped to one knee with a short sound of pain. Owen was already moving. Kale released Garrett and turned, meeting Owen with a forearm block that sent Owen's first strike wide, and then Kale hit him once, clean and deliberate, and Owen stumbled backward into the table behind him, sending glasses and cutlery skidding to the floor. The older man in the green coat let out a sharp cry and pressed himself against the wall. 2 down in the first 8 seconds. Kale had half a breath to feel something like confidence before the other 3 closed in from different angles at the same moment, and he understood immediately that this had been planned. Garrett and Owen had been meant to draw his attention and position him. The real attack came from the sides. He blocked the first strike but took the second across the left shoulder, and then a third connected with his side, and the pain was sharper than it should have been, because whatever was in his system was making everything slower. His reactions were still faster than any ordinary person's, but they were not what they should have been, and against 3 prepared opponents working together, that difference was enough. He drove an elbow into the nearest man's ribs. He heard something crack. The man went down. That left 2. Garrett had recovered and rejoined the effort, which made it 3 again, and they pressed him toward the wall near the window with coordinated movements that showed they had spent time rehearsing exactly this. The couple who had been sitting near the window scrambled away from their table and huddled near the far corner of the room. Kale fought. He did not stop fighting. He broke one man's grip twice, took a knee to the side that would have floored a smaller person, and landed 4 more clean strikes that had real effect. But he was slowing, and they knew it, and they pressed harder. Garrett got an arm around his neck from behind. Owen drove a shoulder into Kale's midsection. The third man grabbed both of Kale's arms and pulled them back. Kale's legs nearly went out. He held them, barely. "We're not here to make you suffer," Garrett said, breathing hard against the side of Kale's face. "We just need it to be over." Owen stepped back and reached beneath his coat. What he produced was a long blade, with a dull gray edge that caught the restaurant's warm light and gave nothing back. Silver, alloyed with something else. Kale could feel it from where he stood. This was it then. This was the moment someone had spent a great deal of time and money preparing. Kale measured his remaining options and found them limited. His strength was draining faster than he had expected. The substance in his meal was working steadily and efficiently, like something designed by someone who understood exactly how to apply it. Owen raised the blade, and then a serving tray clattered to the floor. The sound was sharp and sudden in the tense silence of the room, and every head turned. The young waitress was standing 3 feet away. She had crossed the room without any of them noticing, which was either remarkable or alarming, or both. She had dropped the tray deliberately, and now she was standing between Owen and Kale, her hands at her sides, her posture straight, and her face completely still. "Put that down," she said to Owen. Her voice was low and even. Owen stared at her. Garrett stared at her. Even the men holding Kale's arms went still for a moment, not because she was threatening, but because something about her voice made the air in the room feel different, heavier, like pressure changing before a storm. "Walk away," Garrett said to her. "This has nothing to do with you." "I know exactly what this has to do with," she said. "That's why I'm standing here." Her eyes moved briefly to Kale's. Something passed between them, some quick, wordless exchange, and then she looked back at Owen and his blade. Owen took a step toward her. "Move." She did not move. Owen took another step, and she reached out and caught his wrist, the one holding the blade, with one hand. She caught it the way someone catches a door before it closes, easy and certain, and Owen's forward motion stopped completely. His face changed. The certainty went out of it. "I said put it down," she said again. And the man who had just held a blade over the Alpha King's head, slowly, without fully understanding why, lowered his arm. The grip on Kale's arms loosened. Not gone, but loosened. The men holding him were looking at the waitress the way people look at something they cannot classify. Kale straightened. He breathed. He looked at the young woman who had just walked into the middle of 5 trained men to place herself between a blade and a king she had never met. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. Her expression was still unreadable, but her eyes were sharp and very, very steady. "Can you stand?" she asked him quietly. "I can stand," he said. "Good," she said. "Because what I'm about to tell these men is going to take a few minutes, and I need you to hear it too." Garrett moved behind her. "You have no idea what you are involved in." "I know exactly what I am involved in," she said, and her voice carried something in it, now that it had not carried before. "Something old and certain and deeply tired. I have been involved in it since I was 12 years old. I just never thought it would come back to this restaurant." She looked at each of the 5 men in turn. Then she looked back at Kale. "My name is Alara Voss," she said. "And there is something all of you need to know." The silence that followed those words had a different quality to it than the silence that had filled the room when the first fist hit the table. That earlier silence had been the silence of fear. This one was the silence of attention. Even the couple pressed against the far wall had stopped moving entirely, watching the slim waitress with the steady voice the way you watch someone standing at the edge of something very high. Garrett Cole had not released his position behind her, but he had not moved closer either. Owen Drake still held the gray-edged blade, though his grip on it had loosened. The other 3 men were watching Alara the way wolves watch something they cannot identify by scent. That, Kale realized, was the problem. He was watching her too, and she had no scent. Not in the way that people who suppressed their nature had no scent, with that faint chemical edge beneath the surface that trained senses could detect. She had no scent, the way a sealed room has no wind. It was not suppression. It was something else entirely. Kale was still upright, but only partly by effort. The substance in his system was working through him steadily, and he could feel the edges of his vision beginning to soften. He kept his weight even between both feet and kept his breathing slow, giving nothing away to the men in the room. "The blade Owen is holding," Alara said, "is coated with a compound called nightshade silver. Most people who have heard that name think it's a myth. It is not a myth. It was developed by my family roughly 40 years ago, at the request of the High Council, as a last resort tool for subduing rogue wolves who could not be restrained by ordinary means. The formula was never written down. It was passed from healer to healer by memory and by practice, within a single bloodline." She paused. No one spoke. That bloodline was the Silver Moon family. My family. Her voice did not change when she said it. It carried the same flat steadiness it had carried since the moment she had walked across the restaurant floor. 10 years ago, my family was killed. All of them. My mother, my father, my 2 older brothers, my grandmother, who was 73 years old, and had spent 50 years serving pack leaders across this entire region. My cousins, the apprentices who studied under my father, everyone who knew the formula or had ever been taught any part of it. Owen Drake's hand lowered another inch. The blade pointed at the floor now rather than outward. "The official report said it was a pack conflict," Alara continued. "A territorial dispute that escalated. The report named a border pack that had been in disagreement with my family over grazing land. And that pack was penalized, their territory reduced, their leadership removed. Case closed. History moved on." She looked at Garrett when she said the next part. 2 of the 5 packs standing in this room tonight were named as witnesses in that report. Their testimony was used to support the official account. I do not believe either of you knew what your testimony was being used for. But I need you to understand that the account was false. The pack named in the report had nothing to do with what happened to my family. Garrett's expression shifted. Something in his face that had been hard and certain went uncertain. Then who did? Owen asked. His voice was quieter than it had been. Alara turned her eyes toward Kale. He held her gaze and said nothing. That is the part that connects to what is happening in this room tonight, she said. The substance in the king's food is nightshade silver. Not the blade compound, which works on contact through skin. The ingested form, which works differently and more slowly, and is considerably more dangerous. It was put in the food he was served tonight. Quelt. The couple near the wall exchanged a glance. The older man in the green coat had not moved in several minutes. He was listening with the focused stillness of someone who understood that they were hearing something that could not be unheard. Kale spoke for the first time since Alara had placed herself between him and Owen. You knew it was in the food. I recognized it when I brought it to your table, she said. The smell is undetectable to most people. I am not most people. I learned to identify every compound my family ever developed before I was old enough to understand what most of them were for. You brought it to my table anyway. I brought it to your table because I needed to know whether you were the one who ordered it or the one who was meant to receive it, she said. I have been watching this restaurant for 3 years, waiting to see who would eventually come here and order the dish it was placed in. Tonight you came, and you are clearly not the one who ordered it. Kale looked at her steadily. How did you know I wasn't? Because the person who ordered it would not eat it, she said simply. You ate it without hesitation. You didn't know. There was a pause. And the person who did order it, Kale said, is the same person who hired these 5 men. I believe so, yes. Owen set the blade down on the nearest table. It was a deliberate movement, unhurried, and it changed the character of the room considerably. The men holding Kale's arms had already stepped back. Garrett moved around to face Alara directly. His expression was not hostile now. It was something harder to name. A man who has carried a certainty for a long time, and is beginning to feel the weight of it shift. We were told that the king was responsible for the Silver Moon massacre, Garrett said. We were told that 6 months ago, by someone we trusted, someone who has been helping us build this for years. We were told that tonight was our chance to answer for what his family did. My family was killed before this king took the throne, Alara said. He would have been 21 years old at the time. He was in the Northern Territories for his mandatory border service. I know because I checked. I have spent 10 years checking everything. The stillness in the room deepened. Who told you? Kale asked Garrett. Garrett looked at him. The last of the resistance in his face had gone. What was left looked like a man standing in a room that had just been rearranged around him. Regent Marcus, Garrett said. Your uncle. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Kale did not move. He did not react. He simply held the name in his mind for a long, measured moment and felt something settle into place, the way a key turns in a lock. The way the last piece of something fits and makes the whole shape visible. Marcus, his father's younger brother, his regent during the 3 years between the old king's death and Kale's coronation, the man who had sat at the High Council table for 2 decades, who had attended every state dinner, who had embraced Kale at his own father's funeral and told him that the family would hold together no matter what came. Marcus, who had access to his schedule, who knew his habits and his history, and the name of the one restaurant that Kale had never mentioned to anyone, but carried in memory because his mother had brought him here when he was 7 years old and called it the best meal she had ever eaten. Marcus, who would have known exactly which dish Kale would order because Kale had told the story of that meal in a private council dinner 2 years ago, and Marcus had been sitting 4 seats to his left. Alara was watching his face, not with sympathy exactly, but with something that understood what the moment cost. He commissioned the formula, she said quietly. My father refused him the first time. He was approached on behalf of a council member, and the request was vague, and my father said no. The second time, someone came directly, with enough detail to make clear that it was not a request. My father was given 2 weeks to produce a working batch of the ingested compound. He did it because they threatened my younger brother, who was 6 years old. Her voice did not break. It had the quality of something that had already been broken long ago and had since gone still. Once the formula was delivered, we were a problem to be removed. Everyone who knew it, everyone who might someday say where it came from. Owen Drake sat down heavily in one of the restaurant chairs. He put his face in his hands for a moment, then lifted it. "We were used," he said. "Yes," Alara said. "If Marcus wanted the king dead tonight," Garrett said slowly, working through it, "and the king is now still alive, and we are now standing in this room having this conversation, then whoever Marcus sent to confirm the outcome is going to report back soon," Cale said. His voice was steady and clear despite what was moving through his system, and when the confirmation does not come, he will know something went wrong. Alara nodded once. He will also move immediately to protect himself. He has had 10 years to prepare for contingencies. The moment he suspects this plan has failed, the first thing he will do is establish a new account of events. Cale looked at her. "What kind of account?" Alara met his eyes without blinking. "He will say that I poisoned you, that a rogue Omega with a grudge against the ruling bloodline tampered with your food. It will explain the suppressant, explain your condition, and give him a clean line of distance from everything that happened here tonight." A sound came from the back of the restaurant. Not loud, a soft, deliberate knock at the locked kitchen door. Then a second knock, then a third, in a specific pattern. One of the men who had been standing near the back door looked at Garrett with wide eyes. "That's our contact signal," he said. "Someone outside is checking in." Cale straightened fully, drawing on the last of what he had. The room was slightly tilted at the edges, and his shoulder ached from the earlier impact, and the weight in his blood was real and serious. But his voice carried the full authority of someone who had spent a decade governing with it when everything else was uncertain. "Do not answer," he said. Everyone in the room looked at him. He looked at Alara. "How long do I have before what is in my system becomes genuinely dangerous?" She studied him the way a healer looks at someone, clinical and quick and honest. 3 hours before it starts affecting your heart, maybe 4, depending on how much you ate. "Can it be treated?" "Yes," she said. "I can treat it. I am the only person alive who can." The knock came again at the back door, louder this time. Cale turned to Garrett. Whatever divided them, whatever history sat between their families, it was a lesser fact than the one now sitting at the center of the room. "You came here because someone told you I was your enemy," Cale said. "I am asking you now, as the man you came here to confront, help me get out of this building, before that door is opened by someone who is not in this room." Garrett Cole looked at him for a long moment. Garrett was a man who had organized this night around a certainty, and the certainty had dissolved entirely in the past several minutes. But he was also a man who had spent 20 years watching his pack diminish because of someone else's choices, and he knew better than most what it felt like to be directed by a hand that did not care about the outcome for him. He looked at Owen. Owen nodded. "There is a side exit," Garrett said. "We checked the building when we planned this. It comes out on the north lane." "Show me," Cale said. Alara picked up her coat from the hook near the kitchen door. She did not ask for permission. She did not look at anyone for confirmation. She simply put on her coat as if the next part of the evening were already settled. "I need my kit," she said, and went through the kitchen at a pace that made clear she expected everyone else to keep up. Cale followed her. Behind him, after a beat of hesitation that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, Garrett Cole and Owen Drake and the other 3 men came with them. The knock at the back door came a 4th time as they moved through the kitchen. Then it stopped. That silence was worse than the knocking. They found the side exit behind a shelf of dry goods, exactly where Garrett had said. Alara pushed through it first, into the cool dark of the north lane. Her coat pulled close, her breath steady. The kit she had retrieved from beneath the kitchen counter held in both hands. Cale stepped through behind her into the night air. He had perhaps 3 hours. There was a regent in the capital who was already, at this exact moment, beginning to prepare the story of what had happened here. And the only person who could keep him alive long enough to answer for it was a woman he had known for less than an hour, who had grown up learning to build the very thing that was currently working through his blood. North or east? Garrett asked quietly behind him. Alara was already moving. North, she said. I know somewhere safe. Kale fell into step beside her. The lane was narrow and dark, and the restaurant's lights were already disappearing behind them. Somewhere in the city ahead, his guards were waiting at the palace for a king who had slipped out for a private evening and was now walking through shadow streets with 5 border pack leaders and a healer the world believed to be dead. He glanced at her as they moved. She was looking straight ahead, her jaw set, her pace quick and certain, like a woman who had been waiting for this specific night for a long time and had decided exactly how to handle it. The ledger you mentioned, he said, keeping his voice low. The payment records. You have them? I have had them for 3 years, she said. I have been waiting for a reason to use them that would not get me killed. Tonight is that reason. She glanced at him sideways, the faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, something quieter and more complicated. Tonight, she said, is that reason? They moved deeper into the dark together, and behind them, the Silver Birch restaurant sat locked and still, and the back door that had received 4 careful knocks went unanswered, and the person standing outside in the alley waited for a signal that would never come. The safe house Alara led them to was not a house at all. It was a storage room above a paper goods shop on a quiet street called Miller Lane, 3 blocks north of the Market District and 2 blocks west of the old public well that nobody used anymore because the city had put in pipes 20 years ago. The room was clean and organized, in a way that said someone had been living carefully in it for a long time. Not comfortably, but purposefully. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a locked wooden chest under it, a small work table covered in stoppered bottles and folded cloth, and neat stacks of handwritten pages, and a single oil lamp on a hook near the door. There were no windows, which was either a disadvantage or a deliberate choice, and given everything Kale had learned about Alara Voss in the last 40 minutes, he was confident it was deliberate. She set her kit on the table and opened it with quick hands. The 5 men had crowded into the stairwell and the upper landing. Garrett had posted 1 man at the base of the stairs with instructions to watch the street, and Owen had taken the landing, which left the 3 others filling the doorway of the small room in a way that made it feel even smaller. Kale sat on the edge of the cot because she directed him there, with a single gesture, and because, if he were honest, sitting down was becoming necessary rather than optional. The tilt at the edges of his vision had deepened during the walk, and his left hand was slightly numb, which was new and not encouraging. Left hand, he said. Alara looked up from the kid immediately. How long? Started about 10 minutes ago. She crossed to him in 2 steps, took his left hand in both of hers, and pressed 2 fingers firmly to the inside of his wrist. She counted to herself for several seconds, her eyes focused on something internal rather than on him. Then she pressed 2 different points, slightly lower, and counted again. It is moving faster than I expected, she said. Her voice was clinical. Not alarmed, but direct in the way that suggested she was cutting out anything that was not useful. You are larger than the model I was working from. More body mass. But the compound concentrates near the circulatory branching points, and in someone your size, there are more of them. She released his hand. I need to start the counteragent now. It is going to take 2 rounds. The first round will slow the progression. The second will reverse it. There will be approximately 40 minutes between the 2. Understood, Kale said. It will not be comfortable. Also understood. She was already working, measuring from a small amber bottle into a shallow glass, adding 3 drops from a second bottle, swirling it in a specific motion that was clearly practiced, not stirring so much as folding the liquids together. She added a pinch of something dried from a sealed paper packet, and the mixture changed color, going from pale yellow to a deep brownish amber. Where did you keep all of this? Kale asked, watching. In the restaurant, she said. In a locked box beneath the kitchen floor, under the flower shelf. For how long? Since I arrived in this city. She set the glass down and picked up the packet to fold it closed again. I have moved the kit 4 times. This is the 5th location. You anticipated needing it. She looked at him. I have been anticipating needing it since the night I buried my father in an unmarked field because I was 12 years old and I could not risk being found near an identified grave. She said it the same way she said everything else, without performance, without asking for a response. I have spent 10 years expecting the night when everything that happened to my family would come back to the surface. I did not know exactly what form it would take. I only knew that I needed to be ready. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you survive, if they killed everyone?" "They thought they had," she said. "My mother hid me in the river shed before they came. I was small enough to fit inside the stone wall cavity. I stayed there for 2 days." She picked up the glass and held it out to him. "Drink all of it, slowly." He took it and drank. It tasted of something bitter and something faintly metallic and something else underneath that he could not name. Something that reminded him inexplicably of cold morning air. She turned back to the table and began preparing the second compound. Garrett had moved into the doorway. He was watching Alara with an expression that was difficult to read, but had grief somewhere in the architecture of it. "You knew the report was false," he said. "When we were called to give testimony, you were alive. You knew we were being used as part of a false account." "I was 12 and hiding in a river city 300 miles away," she said, without turning from the table. "I did not know what testimony was being given or to whom. I only read the report 6 years later, when I was old enough to access the public record." "And you saw our pack names in it?" "Yes. Why didn't you contact us? Why didn't you tell us what you knew?" Alara set down the bottle she was holding. She turned and looked at Garrett with complete directness. "Because I did not know which of you was complicit and which had been used," she said. "And because I was a teenage girl with no family, no protection, no legal standing, and a story that directly contradicted an official council record that had been signed off by the regent himself. If I had walked into any public forum and said what I knew, I would have disappeared before morning. Not because the truth was not the truth, but because the truth was inconvenient for a very powerful man, and powerful men have many ways of making inconvenient people go away." Garrett was quiet. Owen spoke from the landing. "The ledger she mentioned. You said payment records. In whose handwriting?" "The original transaction request is in Marcus's hand," she said. "The payment disbursement is recorded in the hand of the council treasurer at the time, who died of natural causes 4 years ago, which was either convenient or engineered, and I have my suspicions about which." She turned back to the table. "The ledger itself was my father's. He kept records of every commission he received, every client, every compound produced. He kept it because he believed that the work his family did should be accountable, that no healer should be able to claim they did not know what they were making and for whom." She paused. Her hands had stilled on the table. "He did not expect to die for that principle," she said quietly. "But I think, if he had known, he would have kept the records anyway." The room was very still. The oil lamp threw warm light across the work table and across Alara's hands, and across the 5 men in the doorway, who had come to this night as instruments of a revenge that had now entirely transformed into something else. Cale felt the first compound beginning to work. The tilt at the edges of his vision steadied somewhat, and the numbness in his left hand receded a small measure. Not gone, but pulled back. "The ledger," he said. "Where is it?" Alara went to the locked chest under the cot, knelt, and opened it, with a key she wore on a thin cord around her neck beneath her uniform. She removed a flat, cloth-wrapped package and set it on the edge of the cot beside him. He unwrapped it carefully. The ledger was smaller than he had expected. The cover was plain dark leather, worn at the corners. The pages inside were dense with handwriting in 2 different hands, the main body in a neat, compact script that he took to be Alara's father, and occasional notations in the margin in a slightly different hand, finer and more hurried, which might have been her mother or another family member. The pages had the particular quality of something that had been kept with great care over many years and had survived conditions that were not kind to paper. He turned to the pages Alara indicated. The entries were dated. The commission from Marcus was recorded in language that was careful and indirect, the language of someone who knew they were recording something that should not exist. But the name was there, written out in full in the second notation, then again in the payment confirmation. Regent Marcus Ashford. The amount. The compound specified. The date of delivery. And a final line in the margin, in the careful handwriting of a man who seemed to have understood, even as he wrote it, what it might eventually cost him. The entry read, "This record exists so that someone will know." Cale closed the ledger and held it. Though Lara was watching him, he looked up. He knew, Cale said. I think he suspected, she said. He was a healer, not a soldier. He understood that what he had been asked to make was intended for a specific purpose, and he understood that handing it over would not make his family safe. He made the record because he believed that truth should have a witness, even when the witness is only paper. Cale set the ledger carefully on the cot beside him. Garrett came fully into the room. He stood in front of Cale, and the posture was no longer confrontational. It was something entirely different, something closer to a man presenting himself honestly after a long period of having been presented as something else. We were given a direction, and we followed it, he said. We thought we were acting on truth. We were not. He paused. I am not asking for absolution. I am telling you what we were and what we did not know. I know, Cale said. What happens now? Cale looked at the ledger. He looked at Alara, who was measuring the second compound with the same quiet focus she had brought to everything else tonight. He thought about Marcus, somewhere in the capital, sitting in his study, or at his council table, feeling the absence of a confirmation signal, and beginning the process of constructing a new account of the evening's events. Now we make sure he does not get ahead of this, Cale said. Alara set a second glass in front of him. Drink this one faster, she said, and then rest for 30 minutes. Not because I am asking, because the compound requires it to work properly. He drank it. It was sharper than the first, and left a clean, cold feeling across his chest that was oddly clarifying. 30 minutes, he said. I will wake you, she said. He lay back on the narrow cot with the ledger resting beside him, and the 5 men arranged themselves throughout the room and the landing, and the oil lamp burned quietly, and Alara Voss sat at her work table, and worked by lamplight, preparing what would come next with the careful steadiness of someone who had been preparing for it for a very long time. Cale was awake before the 30 minutes ended. He knew he was because his internal sense of time had never failed him even in the worst circumstances, and when Alara turned from her table to check on him, he was already sitting up. She studied him briefly. Then she crossed to him and pressed her fingers to the inside of his wrist again, counting to herself. Better, she said. How much better? Enough, she said. The compound has been arrested. You are not out of it, but the progression has stopped, and the second dose will begin reversing it over the next 2 hours. You will feel the residual effects for another day. Do not do anything physically demanding in that time. Define demanding. She looked at him. Storming the palace. That is probably on the list, he said. I know, she said. I mean, do not do it alone, and do not do it tonight. He stood. His legs held. The tilt was gone from his vision, and the numbness had fully left his hand. He felt slow in a way he was not accustomed to, like thinking through thick air, but the slowness was honest now, rather than collapsing. Garrett had stationed the men sensibly, one on the street, one at the base of the stairs, Owen on the landing. The remaining 2 had taken positions at either end of the upper floor. They had done this without instruction, falling back into the competence that trained people fall back into when the situation clarifies. Cale went to the work table and looked at what Alara had been preparing while he rested. There were 3 small sealed bottles, each labeled in a handwriting so precise it looked printed. There was a folded set of papers covered in notes. There was a second cloth-wrapped package, slightly smaller than the ledger. What is in the second package? He asked. Letters, she said. My father wrote them the night before he was killed. One for each of his children. He must have known something was coming. My older brothers never received theirs. I found mine in the cavity where I was hidden, tucked behind a stone, 3 days after everything happened. She did not look at the package when she spoke about it. I have carried them for 10 years. They are not useful as evidence. They are simply evidence that he existed and that he loved his family, and I carry them because there is no one left to carry them except me. The room was quiet. Cale looked at the woman standing at the work table in the lamplight, who had grown up alone with a secret that could not be spoken and a grief that could not be shared, who had chosen a job in a restaurant because it was invisible and safe and near the one location she suspected might eventually become relevant, and who had walked across a locked room to stand between a blade and a man she had no reason to protect, except that she had recognized what kind of night it was. The Silver Moon name, he said. It was formally stricken from the council record after your family was killed. Yes, she said. That record can be corrected. She turned and looked at him. That is a conversation for after, she said carefully. Yes, he agreed. But I am telling you now, so you know it is in the record. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the table and picked up the folded notes. What I have prepared tonight, she said, is a consolidated account, the ledger entries copied with full reference to the original pages, the timeline of my family's movements in the weeks before the massacre, which contradicts the official account at 11 specific points, the names of 2 people who were present the night my family died, who are still alive and who I believe can be made to testify if they are given proper protection and if the right questions are asked in the right setting. She handed him the folded pages. This is not enough to convict, she said. Not by itself. For that you need the original ledger presented before the full council, and you need Marcus to be present and unable to leave, and you need the account given quickly enough that he cannot get ahead of it with his own version. A public session, Cale said. A public session, she confirmed, where everything is heard by enough people that it cannot afterward be quietly revised. Garrett spoke from the landing doorway. Marcus has allies on the council. He has 3 firm allies and 2 sympathetic ones, Cale said. I know his council position exactly. I have been watching it for 2 years, because his influence in certain committee votes has always struck me as disproportionate. He paused. I did not know why until tonight. Can you call a session without his knowledge? Ilara asked. I can call an emergency session on the grounds of an attempt on the king's life, Cale said. That is my authority alone, no other signature required. No advance notice to the full council. He looked at Garrett. I need someone to carry a message to my head of personal security. His name is Philip Crane. He reports to me and to no one else. And he has never once in 12 years given Marcus so much as a courtesy briefing. I trust him completely. Where is he? Garrett asked. He will be at the palace. He will have realized by now that I did not return on schedule, and he will be doing what he always does when I deviate from a schedule, which is sit in his office and wait and refuse to panic. Owen had come to the doorway behind Garrett. How do we get a message to him without going through palace channels that Marcus might monitor? Philip has a brother, Cale said. Edmund Crane. He keeps a print shop on the Eastern Market Road. Philip comes to see him every Tuesday evening. Tonight is Tuesday. Ilara looked at him with something that might, briefly, have been appreciation. You know your people well. I know the people I trust, he said. I make it a priority. Garrett nodded once. I will go. You will need to show Philip something that proves I sent you, Cale said. He reached beneath his collar and removed a small seal he wore on a chain, the private counterpart to the official royal seal, which Philip Crane was the only other person to know existed. He handed it to Garrett. Show him this, and tell him the king is well, and needs him at the print shop within the hour. Tell him nothing else. Philip will understand. Garrett took the seal. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who a few hours ago had intended to end the life of the person who just handed it to him, and who now understood the full distance between where he had stood then and where he stood now. He went without another word. Owen looked at Cale. The 3 of us will stay. I know, Cale said. Ilara had begun packing the ledger and the prepared documents into a satchel. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had packed quickly in difficult circumstances before, and had learned to do it without wasted motion. When Philip Crane comes, Cale said to her, he will arrange transport. You will come with me to the palace. She paused in her packing. The story Marcus is building will name me as the one who poisoned you. Yes. Walking into the palace puts me directly in the path of that story. Yes, Cale said again. Which is why you will walk in beside me, in the company of my head of personal security, carrying the ledger, before Marcus has the opportunity to complete the account he is currently building. He met her eyes. You have spent 10 years being careful and staying invisible. Tonight that ends. Because the safest place you can be right now is not hidden. It is visible, in front of witnesses who cannot be managed. Ilara looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight, she looked exactly as she had looked in the restaurant, steady and contained, and very, very awake. All right, she said. She finished packing the satchel and buckled it closed and set it on the table between them. I want you to know something, she said, and her voice was slightly different than it had been. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. My father believed that the truth was worth keeping. He was not wrong. He was only wrong about how long it would take for someone to come along who could do something with it. Cale said nothing. He held her gaze and let the words sit where they had landed. Alara picked up her coat. We should be ready when Crane arrives. He nodded. We will be. Below, on the quiet street called Miller Lane, the night was cool and uneventful, and nobody passing by had any reason to look up at the dark window of the storage room above the paper goods shop, where a king and 5 former enemies, and a healer the world believed to be dead, were quietly preparing to walk back into the city and change everything. The print shop belonging to Edmund Crane was narrow and smelled of ink and paper in the particular way that old shops smell when their walls have absorbed decades of their trade. The front was dark when Garrett arrived, but a light moved behind the frosted glass of the back window, and when Garrett knocked, the light went still. A moment passed. Then Edmund opened the door, took one look at Garrett and the seal in his hand, and said, "Wait here," and went back inside. Philip Crane arrived 14 minutes later. He was a lean man in his late 40s, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable a long time ago. Not unfriendly, just contained. He looked at Garrett. He looked at the seal. He looked at Garrett again. "Where is he?" Philip said. Garrett told him, in as few words as possible, because the man's stillness was the kind that did not invite excess. Philip asked 4 questions. Garrett answered them directly. Philip listened, then turned to his brother and said something brief and quiet, then looked back. "Stay here," he said to Garrett, and then he was gone. He returned in 31 minutes with a closed carriage, and 2 guards who were clearly not in palace uniform, clearly not unfamiliar with that carriage, and clearly not interested in drawing any attention whatsoever. The ride from Miller Lane to the palace took 18 minutes. Cale sat with the satchel across his knees, and Philip Crane across from him, and Philip said nothing about the 5 border pack men who had come along, or about the quiet woman sitting beside Cale, with the kind of posture that said she was absolutely prepared for whatever was about to happen. Philip said only one thing during the ride. He looked at Cale in the moving dark of the carriage and said, "Marcus called an emergency council session 20 minutes ago. Grounds listed as concern for the king's welfare following a report of unusual activity near the border district." Cale said, "He is getting ahead of it." "Yes," Philip said. "How much ahead?" "Not enough," Philip said. "We will get there first." They arrived at the palace through a side entrance that bypassed the main receiving hall and the council anteroom, and Philip moved them through corridors that Cale knew, but that were not the corridors Marcus would be watching or that his allies would be covering. The great council chamber had 43 seats arranged in a curved formation around a central floor. When Cale entered, 26 of those seats were filled. Councilors who had received Marcus's urgent summons and come quickly, pulling on formal coats over evening clothes, with the slightly disoriented expression of people summoned by alarm. Marcus was standing at the front of the room near the central floor, speaking to 3 councilors whose expressions were grave and attentive. He had clearly been laying the groundwork for several minutes. He saw Cale enter. The sentence he was midway through stopped completely. The room went quiet in stages, like a wave moving through water. Cale walked to the center of the floor. He did not hurry. He moved at exactly the pace of a man who has absolute right to be in the room he is standing in, and knows it. Alara walked beside him. She did not drop her eyes or adjust her pace, or make any accommodation for the fact that 26 senior council members had just turned to look at her, with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. She walked the way she had walked across the restaurant floor, to place herself between a blade and a king, with the steady, purposeful correctness of someone who has decided that this is the place to be, and has finished second-guessing it. Marcus recovered quickly. He had always been good at recovery. "Cale?" he said, and the warmth in his voice was exactly calibrated. Concern, relief, the warmth of a family member who has been worried. "We had reports of trouble near the border district. I was informed there may have been an incident, that you may have been in danger, and I called the council immediately, because the protocol for a potential threat to the king requires—" "Marcus," Cale said. His uncle stopped. "I know," Cale said. The chamber was very quiet. Someone near the back shifted in their chair, and the sound of it was audible. Marcus looked at Alara. Something moved quickly behind his eyes, a calculation, a reorientation, the look of a man who has stepped onto a floor expecting it to be solid and found something different. "Who is this?" Marcus said. The warmth had thinned slightly, like a coating applied too quickly. "My name is Alara Voss," she said to the room, not just to Marcus. Her voice was clear and carried to the back wall without effort. "My family name is Silvermoon. I am the surviving daughter of Edmund Voss Silvermoon, master healer and keeper of the Silvermoon compound records, who was killed along with my entire family 10 years ago in an event recorded officially as a pack territorial dispute." The chamber did not move. "I am here tonight," she continued, "because I have in this satchel a ledger kept by my father that records, in his own handwriting, a commission received, a compound produced, and a payment confirmed, all bearing the name and seal of the man standing at the front of this room." Philip Crane's voice came from the side of the chamber. "By order of the Alpha King, this chamber is now in formal session. The doors are sealed. No member may leave until the session is concluded." Marcus turned to look at Philip. Then he turned back to look at Cale. The warmth in his expression had gone entirely. What was left was something Cale had never seen on his uncle's face before, partly because it had always been so carefully covered, and partly because Marcus had never, until this exact moment, needed to stop covering it. "This is a fabrication," Marcus said. "This woman is the one who targeted you tonight. She is a rogue. She has a vendetta against the ruling bloodline. She tampered with your food and arranged the attack, and now she is standing in front of you with a story designed to redirect suspicion. The men who attacked me tonight are in the custody of my guards," Cale said. "They are alive and unharmed, and they have given their accounts to Philip Crane over the last 40 minutes. Those accounts name you. They have named you in writing, each of them separately, before they had the opportunity to coordinate, and the accounts are consistent." Marcus straightened. "They are criminals, border pack remnants. They have every motivation to point at a council member to mitigate their own." "The ledger," Alara said. She opened the satchel and withdrew the cloth-wrapped package and set it on the central council table. She unwrapped it carefully, the way her father must have wrapped it, with the precise care of someone who believed that what they were handling mattered. She turned to the page she had marked. She held it up. "This entry," she said, "is dated. This commission was received and recorded 14 days before my family was killed. The compound requested is nightshade silver, ingested form. The client named is Regent Marcus Ashford. The delivery is confirmed. The payment is recorded." She set the ledger down flat on the table so the nearest counselors could see. "My father wrote in the margin that he was keeping this record so that someone would know. He did not survive to see whether anyone ever did." Marcus looked at the ledger. He looked at the room. He looked at the doors, which were sealed. He looked at Cale. "Whatever you think you have," he began. "I think I have the truth," Cale said. "And I think you have known, for 10 years, that it was out there somewhere. And I think that is why you spent 10 years watching for it, and why tonight was not actually about the 5 border pack men. Tonight was about finishing what you started a decade ago, because you have always known that the one thing that could reach you was the record my father kept, and the child who hid in a stone wall and survived." The room was completely still. Marcus stood in it. He was still well-dressed and well-groomed, and still had the face of a man who had spent decades presenting the right version of himself to every room he entered. None of that had changed. But the room around him had changed, and the faces in it had changed, and the sealed doors had changed, and the young woman standing at the council table with her father's ledger had changed everything that his careful presentation was designed to protect. Cale looked at his uncle for a long moment. He had embraced this man at his father's funeral. He had sat across council tables from this man for 10 years. He had taken, without question, the map of the world that this man had quietly helped to construct over 2 decades. A map that said the Silvermoon family had died in a border dispute, that 5-pack leaders were enemies of the crown, that the history of certain events was settled and recorded. None of it was the map he had believed he was reading. "Remove him from the chamber," Cale said to Philip Crane. "Formal custody, no council access, and no communication until a full investigation has been completed." Philip moved. The 2 guards with him moved. Marcus looked, briefly, as though he might say something further, and then he looked at Alara one final time, and whatever he saw in her face, steady and unafraid and entirely resolved, made him close his mouth. He did not fight the custody. He walked with the guards in the way that men walk when they have run out of moves and know it. The chamber doors opened to let them through, and then closed again. Cale turned to the council. 26 faces, all of them watching him. Some with confusion, some with understanding, some still sorting through what they had just witnessed. The investigation will be full and public, Cale said. Every piece of this will be heard in open session. Nobody in this room needs to take my word for it. The evidence will speak. That is what it was kept for. He looked at the ledger on the table. He looked at Alara, standing beside it. She was not looking at the council. She was looking at the ledger, with an expression that was private and very quiet, the look of someone who is completing something that has taken far too long to reach its end. Cale stepped to her side. "You said your father believed truth should have a witness," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. He was right. She did not respond immediately. Then she looked up at him, and her expression was not entirely composed anymore, though she was clearly doing her best to keep it that way. The composure had served her well for 10 years. It had kept her moving through a world that had no place for her grief. But there is a moment in some things when the task is done and the composure has nothing more to protect. And that moment had arrived, and she was standing in the middle of it. "He would have wanted to see this," she said. "I know," Cale said. The council chamber began to move around them, councillors rising, voices beginning carefully, the formal process of a kingdom beginning to reckon with a truth it had been carrying sideways for a decade. Philip Crane was coordinating the securing of evidence. Someone had already sent for the senior justice officer. In the middle of all of it, in the center of the curved room with the 43 seats and the high ceilings and the long table and the ledger lying open on it, Cale stood beside the last Silver Moon, who had spent 10 years being a waitress in a border restaurant, waiting for a night exactly like this one, and who had met it exactly as her father would have hoped. 3 weeks after the council session, the Silver Moon name was formally restored in the official record. The annotation removing it was stricken, and in its place was entered a full account: the commission, the deception, the massacre, and the survival of one daughter who had kept her father's ledger and waited. Regent Marcus Ashford was tried before the full council in 2 open sessions and removed from every title and position he held. The verdict, when it came, was read aloud in the main courtyard of the palace to an audience that filled the space and overflowed into the adjacent streets. The 5 border pack leaders gave full testimony and were treated accordingly. Their packs, diminished and repositioned by a war that had been used against them as much as it had been fought against them, began a process of formal renegotiation with the Crown that would take 2 more years to complete, but that started, specifically, because Garrett Cole and Owen Drake had stood in a locked restaurant and listened to the truth when it arrived. The Silver Birch restaurant reopened 6 weeks after the events of that night. The ownership was transferred to a trust bearing the Silver Moon name, and a small brass plaque was placed inside near the door, the kind of thing you would only notice if you were looking for it, commemorating Edmund Voss Silvermoon, healer, record keeper, father, who wrote in the margin of his ledger that he was keeping it so that someone would know. The corner table, where a king had sat alone one evening, and where a serving tray had clattered to the floor, was permanently reserved. It had a small card on it that said simply, in the careful script that the restaurant's manager used for the daily specials, that the table was taken. On the first night the restaurant reopened, 2 people sat there. They arrived without announcement and sat without ceremony, and the staff, who knew the full story because everyone in the border district knew the full story by then, gave them the quiet and the space that the evening called for. Alara Voss ordered the bread and the broth, which were exactly as good as the restaurant's reputation said they were. Cale ordered nothing, and then changed his mind and ordered the bread as well, because she told him it had been the best thing on the menu for 3 years, and he had been too busy nearly dying the last time to appreciate it. She told him about her father, not the story of what happened to him, which Cale already knew, but the other story, the one about the man himself, about the way he had explained compounds to his children with the same seriousness he applied to everything, and about the dried flowers he kept on his workbench because he said they reminded him that delicate things could last a long time if they were handled correctly. She told it without hurry and without the armoring that had kept it safe for a decade, because there was no longer a reason to keep it safe. It was free now to be simply true. Cale listened the way he had listened to the 5 border pack men in the restaurant, and the way he had listened to Alara in the storage room above the paper shop, with the particular attention of someone who understands that what they are hearing has been a long time coming and deserves to arrive without interruption. Outside, the border district was the same as it had always been. The streets were old, and the market was loud, and the public well, that nobody used anymore, stood at its corner, gathering the particular dignity of things that outlast their purpose. Nothing had changed in the architecture or the rhythm of the place. But something had been restored to the record, and there is a difference, small but real, between a world that carries a wound it does not acknowledge and a world that has looked at the wound directly and said, "This is what happened, and this is who was responsible, and this is who survived." Alara picked up her bread. She looked at the corner table, at the walls with their pressed flowers, at the chalkboard near the entrance where tomorrow's specials were already written in careful looping handwriting. "My mother brought me here once," she said, "when I was very small. I did not remember it until I started working here, and then one day I was writing the specials on the board, and the memory came back all at once. The light in the afternoon, the way the floor smelled, sitting across from her, and thinking this was the best place I had ever been." She looked at Kale. "I think that is why I stayed," she said. "Not only for the ledger. I think I stayed because it was the last place that felt like something she had given me." The lamp above their table threw warm light across the wood, and across the pressed flowers, and across the small brass plaque near the door that said what it said. Kale said, "I think she would be glad you stayed." Alara considered this. Then she nodded, slowly, in the way of someone accepting something they have been waiting to be allowed to accept. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." Outside, the evening moved on. The border district settled into its nighttime rhythms. The Silver Birch restaurant held its light against the dark, and the corner table held its two occupants, and the record of the world, corrected at last, held what it had always held, the truth, waiting for someone willing to come and find it.